Find her! The voice sliced through the hushed cathedral-like halls of Westbridge Preparatory Academy, sharp enough to cut glass. Adriana Locke didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. Her tone, a calibrated mix of ice and iron, was more than enough to make the school's headmaster flinch. "We have every available staff member looking, Mrs. Locke," Headmaster Thompson said, his hands fluttering uselessly. "Security is sweeping the grounds as we speak." Adriana's gaze swept over him, dismissing him entirely as she pressed her phone to her ear. "I don't care about your protocol. I care about results. This is a security failure." She paced the polished marble floor, her heels clicking like a metronome counting down to a disaster. Her daughter, Avery, was missing, had been for 47 minutes, vanished somewhere between a third-period calculus test and a scheduled meeting with the guidance counselor. For Adriana, CEO of a multi-billion-dollar tech firm, it wasn't just a family crisis, it was a data breach, a system error in the carefully architected world she had built for her daughter. Across the quad, Nate Coleman pushed his wheeled cart of supplies through a side entrance, the scent of industrial cleaner and sawdust a familiar comfort. His daughter, 10-year-old Maya, trailed beside him, her backpack slung over one shoulder, a sketchbook tucked under her other arm. This was their ritual. Her public school let out an hour before his shift began, so she would sit quietly in his break room, drawing in her book while he prepared for the long night of erasing the day's scuffs and smudges left by the children of the city's elite. "Looks like a storm's brewing, kiddo," Nate said softly, nodding toward the commotion near the main entrance. Men in suits spoke into radios, their faces grim. Maya looked up at the scene, her brow furrowed. "Is someone in trouble?" "Looks like it," Nate said, his eyes scanning the campus. He'd worked at Westbridge for 3 years, and he knew its rhythms better than the people who ran it. He knew the way the sound echoed in the gymnasium after a basketball game, the specific creak of the third-floor library window, and the 1,000 forgotten corners where a child could disappear. He saw Adriana Locke then, a falcon in a bespoke suit, circling her prey. He'd seen her before at board meetings and fundraising events, a remote and powerful figure. Now, her power was coiled into a tight knot of fury. "Stay here for a minute, okay?" Nate told Maya, parking his cart near the janitor's closet. "I have a feeling." He didn't join the official search. He didn't check the manicured lawns or the state-of-the-art athletic fields. He walked past the main building, his worn work boots silent on the flagstone path, and headed toward the old arts annex, a part of the school that was mostly used for storage. He descended a short flight of concrete steps, the air growing cooler, smelling of dust and old paint. He ran his hand along a row of unused lockers and stopped at a small, unmarked wooden door tucked beneath the main stairwell. It was a relic from the original schoolhouse, a space too small for any real purpose, forgotten by everyone. Everyone except a child looking for a place to hide. He pushed the door gently. It wasn't locked. Inside, it was dark, cramped, and silent. For a moment, he thought he was wrong. Then he saw her, a small shape curled into a ball behind a stack of old theater props. Avery Locke. Her knees were pulled up to her chest, her arms wrapped around them so tightly her knuckles were white. Her breath came in short, ragged gasps, a tiny, panicked rhythm in the suffocating silence. Nate didn't call out her name. He didn't step inside. He simply stood in the doorway for a moment, letting his presence be known without being a threat. He backed away slowly and spoke quietly into his own walkie-talkie. "She's in the sub-level storage closet. Arts Annex." The response was immediate. Within 2 minutes, the sound of hurried footsteps echoed down the stairs. Headmaster Thompson arrived first, followed by the school nurse, and then Adriana, her face a mask of grim relief that quickly hardened back into anger. "Avery, get out here, right now!" Adriana commanded, her voice leaving no room for argument. From inside the closet, the ragged gasping hitched, turning into a choked sob. The small form curled even tighter. The school nurse stepped forward, her voice professionally gentle but laced with urgency. "Avery, sweetie, you need to come out. We need to make sure you're okay." It was the wrong thing to say. The implication of being not okay only fed the panic. A small, muffled whimper came from the darkness. Adriana's patience snapped. "This is ridiculous. I'm not playing these games." She took a step toward the closet, ready to physically pull her daughter out. "Ma'am, don't." Nate's voice was quiet but firm, stopping her in her tracks. She turned, her eyes flashing with fury, ready to verbally incinerate the janitor who dared to give her an order. But Nate wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the closet. He motioned for Maya, who had followed the commotion and was now standing nervously at the top of the stairs. "Hey, Bug, come here a second." Maya came down, her eyes wide. Nate sat down on the dusty floor, about 5 feet from the closet door, leaning his back against the cool concrete wall. He patted the spot beside him. "Sit with your old man for a minute." Maya sat. Adriana watched, bewildered and incensed. The headmaster and the nurse exchanged confused glances. Nate ignored them all. He looked at his daughter, his voice low and steady, a calm rumble in the tense hallway. "So, tell me about that picture you were drawing today." Maya, sensing her father's intent, opened her sketchbook. "It's a forest," she whispered, her voice a soft counterpoint to the panicked breathing still coming from the closet. "A forest, huh?" Nate said, his eyes still on his daughter. "What kind of colors are in your forest?" "Lots of green," Maya said, tracing a tree with her finger, "and brown for the trunks. And I made the sky. It's not blue. It's the color right before the sun goes all the way down, sort of orange and purple." "Sunset colors," Nate murmured. "That's my favorite. Does it feel warm or cool?" "Warm," Maya said, "and quiet. Like all the birds are getting ready to go to sleep." Inside the closet, the frantic gasping began to slow. The tiny, hitched breaths started to lengthen, almost unconsciously trying to match the calm, steady rhythm of Nate's voice. Avery didn't make a sound, but the terror was beginning to recede, pushed back by this strange, quiet conversation about colors and sunsets. Adriana stood frozen, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. This was illogical. It was inefficient. It made no sense. She had an entire team of psychologists on retainer, the best money could buy. She had built a life, an empire, on solving problems with direct, overwhelming force. Yet here was a janitor, sitting on a dirty floor, talking about a child's drawing, and he was succeeding where everyone else had failed. After a few more minutes of Nate and Maya's soft chatter, a small, pale hand appeared, gripping the edge of the closet door. Then a head, with tangled blonde hair. Avery's eyes, wide and red-rimmed, darted around, skipping past her mother, past the headmaster, and landing on Nate and Maya. She didn't look at them directly, but at the space of calm they occupied. Slowly, unsteadily, she crawled out of the darkness. Not because she was ordered, not because she was coaxed, but because she was drawn toward the one source of stillness in her chaotic world. She sat down on the floor, about 10 feet away from them, and simply wrapped her arms around her knees, listening. The silence that followed was different. It wasn't tense anymore. It was settled. Nate finally looked up, his gaze meeting Adriana Locke's. He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, as if to say, "There, she's back." Adriana stared at him, her mind, which could process 1,000 data points in a second, struggling to compute what she had just witnessed. She saw her daughter, safe. She saw the janitor who had found her. But what she couldn't comprehend, what left her standing there speechless as the world tilted on its axis, was that he hadn't just found where she was hiding. He had understood why. For a long moment, nobody moved. The only sounds were the faint hum of the building's ventilation and Avery's soft, even breaths. Headmaster Thompson was the first to break the spell, clearing his throat and stepping forward with an air of restored authority. "Well," he said, his voice overly brisk. "All's well that ends well. Nurse, perhaps you can escort Avery to your office." He turned to Nate, offering a dismissive nod. "Thank you for your assistance, Mr. Coleman. You can return to your duties." He was re-establishing the order of things. The crisis was over. The janitor could disappear again. "He's not going anywhere." Adriana's voice was low, but it stopped everyone cold. She hadn't moved, her gaze still locked on Nate. She finally looked away, turning her attention to the headmaster. "You and the nurse may go. I'll handle this." It wasn't a suggestion. Thompson and the nurse exchanged a look, but they knew better than to argue with the woman who had single-handedly funded their new science wing. They retreated up the stairs, leaving the four of them in the quiet hallway. Adriana's eyes fell on her daughter, still sitting on the floor, looking small and fragile. Then she looked at Maya, who was watching Avery with an expression of pure, uncomplicated empathy. Finally, her gaze returned to Nate. The questions were piling up behind her eyes, demanding answers her logical mind couldn't provide. "My car will be at the main entrance in 5 minutes," she said to Nate. It was a command disguised as a statement. "I want to speak with you." Nate hesitated, glancing at Maya. "I have to get my daughter home." "Bring her," Adriana said, already turning to walk away. 5 minutes. She didn't wait for a reply. She walked up the stairs, her posture once again ramrod straight, the CEO back in control. Or at least, playing the part. Nate let out a slow breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. He stood, his joints protesting slightly from sitting on the cold concrete. He offered a hand to Avery. The girl flinched, but then, after a long second, she looked at his calloused, clean hand and tentatively took it. Her fingers were ice cold. He helped her to her feet. "You okay?" he asked softly. She gave a tiny, jerky nod, her eyes fixed on the floor. "Good," he said simply. When Adriana's sleek, black sedan pulled up to the curb, Nate was waiting, holding Maya's hand. He opened the back door for Avery, who slipped inside without a word, then helped Maya in beside her. He closed the door and got into the front passenger seat. The car smelled of expensive leather and a faint, sterile perfume. It was like sitting inside a bank vault. The driver, a man with a stony face and an earpiece, pulled away smoothly. Silence stretched between them, thick and awkward. Adriana stared out the window, watching the manicured lawns of Westbridge roll by. "Who taught you that?" she asked at last, her voice devoid of emotion. Whatever that was. The talking about pictures." Nate looked at her profile, sharp and severe against the passing streetlights. "Nobody taught me. It's just something you learn." "Learn where?" she pressed, turning to face him. "What's your background, Mr. Coleman?" "It's Nate," he said, "and I'm a janitor." "I'm aware of your current employment," she said, a hint of impatience in her tone. "I'm asking what qualifies you to handle a child's panic attack better than a trained medical professional." Nate's gaze didn't waver. "My wife," he said, the words costing him something. "Before she passed, she had them too. Bad ones. You learn that you can't charge at the fire. You have to give it a different path. Something quiet to follow until it burns itself out." The confession hung in the air, raw and unexpected. It wasn't in any file she could have pulled on him. It was human. For the first time, Adriana's corporate armor showed a crack. She looked away, a flicker of something unreadable in her eyes. Guilt? No, that was too simple. It was the discomfort of a variable she couldn't account for. "I see," she said, though she clearly didn't. She recalibrated, returning to a language she understood. "I want to hire you." Nate blinked. "Excuse me? I will pay you a handsome consulting fee. Your job will be to be on site, available for Avery, should another episode occur." She was trying to put a price on it, to make it a transaction. "I'm not a therapist, Mrs. Locke," Nate said firmly. "And I'm not for hire." "My daughter is on the verge of being expelled," Adriana snapped, the frustration breaking through. "I have had her evaluated by 3 different specialists. They've given her labels, generalized anxiety, school refusal disorder, and a host of coping strategies that she refuses to use. They talk at her. She listened to you. I wasn't talking to her, Nate corrected gently. I was talking to my daughter. Avery just overheard. A technicality, Adriana dismissed with a wave of her hand. Name your price, Mr. Coleman. Everyone has one. Nate fell silent. He thought of his small two-bedroom apartment, of the bills that piled up, of the quiet worry that was his constant companion. He thought of how easy it would be to say yes. But then he looked in the rearview mirror. Avery was staring out her window, but Maya had reached over and was quietly showing her a drawing in her sketchbook. It was a picture of two girls, one with dark hair and one with blonde, holding hands under a sky full of lopsided stars. What my daughter needs isn't for sale, he said, his voice quiet but absolute. She needs to feel safe. You can't write a check for that. The truth of his words hit Adriana harder than any business negotiation ever had. She was a woman who could move markets with a single phone call, but she was powerless to give her own child the one thing she truly needed. The silence in the car was deafening. Finally, she let out a breath, a sound of genuine defeat. Then what do you suggest I do? She asked, the question stripped of its usual authority. It was a real question. Nate considered it for a long moment. If I agree to help, he said slowly, it's not a job. I don't work for you, I work for her, and it's on my terms. Adriana's eyes narrowed. No one gave her terms, but she was desperate. Which are? When I'm with her, it's just me. No check-ins, no progress reports, no school administrators listening at the door. I'm not going to fix her. I'm just going to provide a quiet place when the world gets too loud. If she chooses to use it, she does. If she doesn't, she doesn't. That's the deal. She studied him, the janitor, the single father, the man who had just refused her money and was now dictating the terms of her daughter's well-being. It was illogical. It was unprecedented. It was terrifying. But the image of Avery crawling out of that dark closet toward the sound of his voice was burned into her mind. Slowly, deliberately, Adriana Locke nodded. Fine, she said, the word feeling foreign in her mouth. We have a deal. The car pulled up in front of Nate's modest apartment building. As he and Maya got out, Adriana watched them. He held his daughter's hand, listening as she chattered about her day, his entire world visibly contained in that small, precious person. Adriana looked at her own daughter in the back seat, still staring silently out the window, a million miles away. For the first time in a very long time, Adriana Locke felt the profound, terrifying weight of her own poverty. The first official day of the deal was louder than any other. For Adriana, the silence was deafening. She sat in her glass-walled office on the 50th floor, the city sprawling beneath her like a circuit board she owned. Usually this view calmed her, a testament to her command. Today, it felt like a cage. She had received only one text from the school. Avery is in attendance, nothing else. She had no data, no updates, no metrics for success. She had ceded control of her daughter's well-being to a janitor, and the not knowing was a physical itch under her skin. Her thumb hovered over the headmaster's contact number, her mind screaming for a status report. Is she in class? Has she had an episode? Has she spoken to the man? But she'd made a deal. Her word in business was law. She let her hand drop, the inaction feeling like a failure. At Westbridge, the 10 a.m. bell shrieked, signaling the end of second period. For Avery, it was a starting pistol. The scrape of 25 chairs against linoleum, the explosion of chatter, the sudden pressure of bodies moving in the hallway. It was too much. Her history teacher, Mrs. Gable, was handing back yesterday's pop quiz. As a paper was placed on the desk in front of her, Avery saw the grade in bright red ink. A minus. It wasn't a bad grade. For any other student, it would be a success. For Avery Locke, daughter of Adriana Locke, it was a siren, a flaw, a crack in the foundation. The red ink seemed to pulse. The hum of the fluorescent lights overhead grew into a roar. The edges of her vision started to feel fuzzy, the room tilting slightly. "You're not good enough. She'll be disappointed. Failure." The words were a silent scream in her head. Her heart began to hammer against her ribs. Her breath caught. "I can't be here." She stood up abruptly. Mrs. Gable looked up, surprised. "Avery, is something wrong?" I need to use the restroom," she stammered, the lie tasting like ash. She didn't wait for a response, just fled the classroom, leaving the red-marked paper behind like a piece of damning evidence. But she didn't go to the restroom. She walked, then half ran, down the hallway, her sneakers squeaking on the polished floors. She bypassed the library, the nurse's office, all the official safe zones. She went down one flight of stairs, then another, following the path she'd seen the janitor take until she reached the basement level. The air here was different. It smelled of old paper and cedar-scented floor cleaner. It was quiet. She found his office, the door propped open with a rubber wedge. The room was small, cluttered, and wonderfully ordinary. A metal desk was covered in catalogs for industrial cleaning supplies. A row of labeled keys hung on a pegboard. On a small, wobbly table in the corner, Maya sat drawing. Her tongue stuck out in concentration. Nate was standing at a deep utility sink, methodically scrubbing a set of brass sconces that had been removed from the main hall. He looked up as Avery appeared in the doorway, her face pale, her breathing shallow. He didn't look surprised. He didn't ask her what was wrong. He didn't say a word. He simply dried his hands on a rag, picked up a clean, soft cloth, and held it out to her. "The secret to brass," he said, his voice calm and even, "is you can't rush it. You have to go in small circles. Same direction, over and over." He handed her a small, tarnished brass plate from a doorknob. "Think you can handle that one?" Avery stared at the cloth, then at the piece of brass. It was a simple, grounding task. No grade, no judgment. She took them without a word and sat down on a stool near the wall, away from the door. She began to polish, her movements clumsy at first, then settling into the steady, circular rhythm Nate had described. Maya looked up from her drawing and gave Avery a small, shy smile, then went back to her work. The only sounds in the room were the soft whisk of Maya's crayons on paper and the gentle, rhythmic scrape of cloth against brass. Nate went back to his own work, the two of them polishing their separate pieces in a comfortable, shared silence. Avery focused on the circle in her hand. The warmth of the metal began to seep into her fingers. The repetitive motion was an anchor, a mantra for her hands that quieted the screaming in her head. The roar of the fluorescent lights upstairs faded. The red A- on her test paper lost its power. There was only the circle, the pressure, the slow, satisfying reveal of the gleaming metal beneath the tarnish. After 10 minutes, that felt like an hour, and an hour that felt like 10 minutes. She stopped. The brass plate in her hand shone like a gold coin. "It's loud upstairs," she whispered to the wall, the first words she had spoken. Nate paused his work, turning to look at her. He simply nodded. "Yeah," he said, "it can be." He didn't ask why. He didn't offer solutions. He just agreed. The simple validation was more powerful than any therapy session she'd ever endured. It was the truth. It was loud upstairs. And down here, it was quiet. He glanced at the large round clock on the wall. "Bell for fourth period is in 5 minutes." He wasn't telling her to leave. He was just giving her information, letting the choice be hers. Avery took a deep breath, the first full, easy one she'd taken all day. She placed the polished brass plate on the edge of his desk. "Thank you," she said softly. "Anytime," Nate replied. She slipped out of the room as quietly as she had entered. As she walked back up the stairs, the sound of the school returned, the distant chatter, the clang of a locker. But it was different now. The volume had been turned down. The noise was still there, but it no longer felt like it was inside her. She had a place to put it. She had a secret weapon, and it was hidden in the basement, in a small, cluttered room that smelled like cedar, where no one asked her to be anything other than what she was. The quiet lasted for 3 days. 3 days in which Adriana Locke adhered to the terms of their deal with a discipline that bordered on painful. She received the single, automated text from Westbridge each morning, Avery Locke, present, and forced herself to interpret the lack of news as good news. At her company, she closed a 9-figure deal with a German tech firm, her focus as sharp and unforgiving as ever. But underneath, a low-frequency hum of anxiety persisted. It was the feeling of a bug in her code, an unknown element she couldn't control. That Friday, she came home to her penthouse apartment. The space was vast and minimalist, all white walls, polished concrete floors, and glass that overlooked the city like the eye of a god. It was a space designed to command respect, but it was also profoundly empty. It smelled of nothing. It held no warmth. Avery arrived an hour later, dropped off by the private driver. She walked in and put her bag down by the door, her movements less furtive than usual. "How was your day?" Adriana asked, her standard opening. She didn't look up from the tablet where she was reviewing quarterly projections. "Fine," Avery said. Usually fine was a wall, a sullen monosyllable designed to end the conversation. Today it sounded different. Just fine. A simple statement of fact. "Did you get the review sheet for your history midterm?" Adriana pressed, moving on to the next item on her mental checklist. "Yes." "Your tutor will be here at 7 to go over it." Avery just nodded and headed toward her room. Adriana finally looked up, a slight frown creasing her brow. There was no argument, no sigh of frustration. The usual friction was gone, replaced by a strange, unnerving calm. Something had shifted in her daughter, but the data was insufficient. It was a change she could feel but not measure, and it was maddening. 20 miles away, in a small 3-room apartment that smelled of garlic and sautéing onions, a different kind of quiet settled. It was the comfortable quiet of home. Nate stood at the stove, stirring a pot of spaghetti sauce, while Maya sat at their small kitchen table, meticulously coloring in a drawing. "You think we should add more oregano?" Nate asked, holding out a wooden spoon for her to taste. Maya took a careful sip. "Needs more, everything," she declared with the gravity of a world-class food critic. Nate laughed, a warm, easy sound that filled the small space. "More everything, huh? You drive a hard bargain." He sprinkled in a few more herbs, his movements relaxed. This was his world, simple, contained, and full of a love so tangible, you could almost taste it in the air. The next week, Adriana did something she hadn't done in years. She cleared her 4 o'clock meeting and told her driver to take her to Westbridge. Her excuse, even to herself, was flimsy. She wanted to pick up Avery personally. The truth was, she needed to see it for herself. She needed to understand the variable named Nate Coleman. She arrived just as the final bell was ringing, the organized chaos of dismissal flooding the campus. She stayed in her car, watching. She saw Avery emerge from a side door, not alone. Nate was with her, pushing his cart of supplies. Maya skipped alongside them. Adriana watched as Avery held up a piece of paper, showing it to Nate. He stopped, leaned in to look, and then smiled. It was a real smile, not the tight, polite one he'd given her. And then Adriana saw something that made her breath catch in her throat. Avery smiled back. Not a huge grin, but a small, genuine curve of her lips. A ghost of a smile she hadn't seen in years. It was a punch to the gut. A quiet, devastating blow. Her daughter was happy, standing in a parking lot with a janitor and his kid. Steeling herself, Adriana got out of the car. The 3 of them looked up as her heels clicked on the asphalt. "Mom?" Avery said, her smile vanishing instantly. her posture stiffening. "Adriana," Nate said, his tone neutral, giving a slight nod. Maya shyly hid behind her father's legs. Adriana's gaze fell on Maya, who was clutching the sketchbook to her chest. "Hello?" Adriana said, her voice softer than she intended. She pointed to the book. "I hear you're quite the artist." Maya blushed, peeking out from behind Nate. "I just like to draw." Adriana looked at Nate, then at her own daughter, who was now staring at her shoes. An impulsive, illogical thought surfaced, and before she could suppress it, she spoke. "You two should come over for dinner." The silence that followed was thick with the weight of the unspoken class divide. Nate's eyes widened slightly. He looked from the impossibly expensive car to the woman who owned it, then to his daughter's hopeful face. "Oh, that's very kind of you, Mrs. Locke, but we couldn't impose," he said, the polite refusal already forming. "We have plans." "We do," Maya whispered, looking up at him with wide, pleading eyes. Adriana saw her opening. She knelt, a gesture so foreign to her that her knees almost protested, until she was at eye level with the two girls. "I was hoping you could show me some of your drawings, Maya. And Avery could show you her horse sketches." Avery's head shot up. Her mother never mentioned her sketches. She looked at Adriana, then at Maya, a flicker of hope in her eyes. It was a quiet, desperate plea that passed between the two 10-year-olds. Nate saw it. He saw the look on his daughter's face, the undisguised longing for a new friend. He saw the fragile hope in Avery's expression. He was trapped. Saying no would mean protecting himself from this complicated, intimidating woman, but it would also mean crushing the spirits of two children who had so little to hope for. He let out a slow, resigning breath. "Okay," he said, the word feeling like a surrender. "Okay, we'd like that." Adriana stood, a flicker of triumph in her eyes, quickly masked. "Tomorrow, then." 6 o'clock. She gave him the address, a string of words that represented one of the most exclusive buildings in the city. As she got back into her car, leaving them standing in the parking lot, the reality of what she'd just done settled in. She had invited her janitor and his daughter for a playdate in her sterile, silent penthouse. It was a collision of worlds she was in no way prepared for. And as Nate looked down at his daughter's beaming face, he felt a knot of dread tighten in his stomach. He had just agreed to walk his family directly into the lion's den. "Is this a hotel, Dad?" Maya whispered, her voice barely an echo in the cavernous lobby. The floors were a sea of polished black marble. The walls were adorned with enormous, abstract paintings that looked angry, and the only person in sight was a man in a severe gray suit, standing behind a desk that looked like a block of ice. Nate squeezed her hand. "Nope, it's an apartment building." "People live here?" she asked, her eyes wide with disbelief. Nate chuckled softly. "Well, some people do." Their names were announced in a hushed tone into an intercom, and a moment later, the silent elevator doors slid open. The ride to the penthouse was so smooth and quiet, it felt like they were ascending into space. When the doors opened directly into Adriana Locke's apartment, Maya gasped. The front door opened into a view. A wall of glass showcased the entire city, glittering like a spilled chest of jewels. The space was immense, furnished with so few items that each one, a severe leather sofa, a single chrome chair, a glass table, felt less like furniture and more like an exhibit. Adriana was standing in the middle of the room, looking just as uncomfortable as they felt. She was wearing simple black trousers and a cream-colored silk blouse that probably cost more than Nate's monthly rent. Her hair was pulled back, but a few stray strands had escaped, a tiny sign that she was not entirely in her element. Avery stood slightly behind her, clutching her hands together, her eyes darting everywhere except at them. "You're here," Adriana stated, the words hanging in the air. "We're here," Nate confirmed, feeling an absurd urge to salute. "Thanks for having us." An awkward silence descended. Nate cleared his throat. Adriana smoothed down her already perfect blouse. Finally, Maya, ever the diplomat, saved them. She walked tentatively toward one of the giant paintings. "That one looks like a grumpy cloud," she said to no one in particular. Avery let out a tiny, choked giggle, then quickly covered her mouth as if she'd broken a rule. Adriana looked at the painting, then at Maya, a flicker of confusion on her face. "It's a Rothberg," she said. "It's about the deconstruction of form." "Oh," Maya said, nodding seriously. "Well, its form is grumpy." The honesty of it seemed to break the tension. Avery took a small step forward. "I can show you my room if you want," she offered quietly to Maya. Maya's face lit up. "Okay." The two girls, united by a common need to escape the stilted adults, scurried off down a long, white hallway. Left alone, Nate and Adriana stood in the vast, silent room. "Can I get you something to drink?" she asked, moving toward a kitchen so sleek and minimalist it looked like it had never been used. "Water is fine, thanks." She retrieved a bottle of sparkling water from a stainless steel refrigerator and poured it into a heavy crystal glass. She handed it to him, their fingers brushing for a fraction of a second. The silence stretched again. "I had dinner brought in," she said, gesturing toward the dining area where a long glass table was set with pristine white plates. "I hope that's all right." Dinner was an exercise in quiet bewilderment. Tiny, artfully arranged portions of food Nate couldn't identify were served by a silent woman in a gray uniform who appeared and disappeared from a hidden door. Nate and Maya exchanged secret, wide-eyed looks over what appeared to be a single scallop sitting in a green foam. Nate saw Adriana watching him, her expression analytical, as if she were trying to solve a complex equation. He decided to face it head-on. "This is a long way from spaghetti and meatballs, huh?" he said with a small, self-deprecating smile. Adriana blinked. "I can have my chef make that next time, if you prefer." "That's not what I meant," Nate said gently. "This is lovely. It's just different." She nodded, though he wasn't sure she understood. She was a woman who solved problems with resources. If he didn't like the food, she would simply procure different food. The concept of a shared experience, of simple, messy, family meals, seemed to be a foreign language to her. After the meal, the girls reappeared. "Can we go draw in my room?" Avery asked her mother. It was the first time she had asked for anything all night. "Of course," Adriana said, a note of surprise in her voice. The girls vanished again, their soft giggles echoing down the hall. Now the silence was even more profound. Adriana walked over to the glass wall and stared out at the city. "The school reports no further incidents," she said, her back to him. "That's good," Nate replied. "What do you do with her?" she asked, turning around. "In the basement. What's your method?" Nate took a sip of water. "We don't have a method, Adriana. I told you, I'm not a therapist." Using her first name felt like a small act of rebellion. "She came down. I gave her something to do with her hands. We sat in the quiet for a bit. That's all." Adriana's brow furrowed. "It can't be that simple. My company develops predictive algorithms based on millions of behavioral data points. Human behavior is a pattern. There must be a pattern here, a technique." "Maybe the technique is not having one," Nate suggested. "Maybe it's just being there, not asking for anything." She crossed her arms, a familiar defensive posture. "I'm always there for her. I provide everything. This school, the tutors, the writing lessons. I built this entire world for her so she would never have to struggle." Nate's voice was soft, but his words landed with precision. "Kids don't need you to build a world for them," he said. "They just need you to come and sit in theirs for a while, even if it's small, or messy, or doesn't make sense." Adriana stared at him, her carefully constructed composure threatening to crumble. He wasn't just talking about Avery anymore. He was talking about her. Before she could form a reply, the sound of laughter, real, unrestrained laughter, drifted down the hall. Avery and Maya ran into the room, their faces flushed with excitement. They were holding up a large piece of drawing paper. On it, in a chaotic explosion of crayon, was a drawing of two figures. One was a magnificent, powerful-looking horse. The other was a small, smiling brown mouse, riding on its back. "Avery taught me how to draw a horse, and I taught her how to draw Squeaky," Maya announced proudly. Avery was beaming, a wide, genuine smile that transformed her entire face. "Squeaky is the hero of Maya's stories," she explained to her mother, her voice full of a light Adriana hadn't heard since she was a toddler. Adriana looked at the drawing, at the messy, joyful, imperfect collaboration between their two daughters. She looked at Avery's shining eyes. All her life, she had measured success in stock prices, market share, and flawless execution. But this messy crayon drawing, felt more valuable than anything her company had ever produced. As Nate and Maya prepared to leave, Avery shyly handed the drawing to her mother. "This is for you," she said. After they had gone, Adriana stood alone in the vast, silent penthouse. The silence felt different now. It felt like a void. She looked down at the drawing in her hand, the brave horse and the little mouse riding together. A warmth spread through her chest, an unfamiliar, aching feeling. It was hope, and it was terrifying. The weeks that followed settled into a fragile, unspoken rhythm. Avery didn't need to flee a classroom to find the quiet anymore. Sometimes, between classes, she would simply slip down to the basement, and Nate would look up from his work and nod. He never asked why she was there. He'd just hand her a rag to help polish the brass fittings he was restoring, or let her watch as he carefully repaired the spine of a broken library book with binding glue. She and Maya had started their own secret project, a comic book series about Squeaky the Mouse and his powerful steed, whom they had named Orion. They would sit at the wobbly table in Nate's office, their heads bent together, one drawing the panels and the other carefully lettering the speech bubbles. For Avery, these stolen 15-minute increments were the only time during the school day when she wasn't performing. She wasn't Avery Locke, the genius with the CEO mother. She was just Avery, the girl who drew horses. Adriana saw the changes in ways her spreadsheets could never capture. Avery started talking at the dinner table, not just about school, but about Orion's latest adventure. One evening, Adriana came home to find Avery in the living room, surrounded by colored pencils, trying to teach herself how to draw a mouse that didn't look like a potato. Adriana found herself lingering by the doorway, watching, a silent observer of her own daughter's hesitant return to the world. She even had the crayon drawing of the horse and mouse framed and placed on her desk at the office, a small, colorful act of rebellion amidst the chrome and glass. But such an unconventional arrangement could not remain invisible forever. The whisper network at a place like Westbridge was more efficient than any corporate intelligence agency. It started with a teacher complaining that Avery had missed a quiz. Then a parent, whose son had been vying for the top spot in the Science Olympiad, noted that Avery Locke seemed to be getting special privileges. The final straw came when a board member's daughter saw Avery coming out of the janitor's office in the basement. The call from Headmaster Thompson was polite, but firm. "Adriana, I think we need to have a chat. In my office, if you would." The headmaster's office was a shrine to tradition and institutional power. Dark wood, leather-bound books she was certain he'd never read, and a large desk that served as a barricade. Thompson steepled his fingers, his face a mask of practiced concern. "Adriana, we have a situation," he began. "It has come to our attention that your daughter has formed an attachment to one of our facilities staff. His name is Nate Coleman," Adriana said coolly, "and he has done more for my daughter's well-being in the last month than your entire guidance department has in the last year." Thompson's smile was tight. Be that as it may, he is not a qualified counselor. He is not a licensed therapist. He has not been vetted for this kind of student interaction. From the school's perspective, and I'm sure you, of all people, can appreciate this, he is an unacceptable liability. The old Adriana would have agreed instantly. She would have seen the logic, the risk analysis. She would have cut the liability without a second thought. But as she sat there, the image of Avery's genuine, unforced smile flashed in her mind. "He is a good man, Robert," she said, her voice even. "And he is the only person my daughter feels safe with in this entire building." "Safety is our paramount concern," Thompson countered smoothly, "which is why we cannot sanction this. A janitor, however well-intentioned, having private meetings with a student in the basement. Think of the optics. Think of the precedent. We have a reputation to uphold." "My daughter's health is more important than your reputation," Adriana shot back, her corporate instincts kicking in. "And let's talk about results. Avery's attendance in class is up. Her grades, with the exception of one quiz she missed while averting a full-blown panic attack, have stabilized. She is participating. Those are your metrics, Robert. And by those metrics, this unacceptable liability is a resounding success." The headmaster was taken aback. He had expected a swift corporate resolution. He was not prepared for a fight. He leaned back, his expression hardening. "The board has discussed this," he said, his voice losing its fabricated warmth. "We appreciate your family's long-standing support of Westbridge, Adriana. But we have a protocol. We have a legal duty of care. This arrangement with Mr. Coleman must end immediately." Adriana felt a cold knot form in her stomach. "And if I refuse?" Thompson took a deep breath, the final, regretful move of a corporate executioner. "Then we will be forced to conclude that Westbridge is no longer equipped to meet Avery's unique needs. The board will have no choice but to begin proceedings to terminate her enrollment." The threat hung in the air, polished and deadly. Expulsion, the ultimate failure. Her daughter would be kicked out of the school her family's name was carved into, all because of a janitor who had shown her kindness. "You would do that?" Adriana whispered, the words catching in her throat. "You would punish a child for finding a way to cope with the pressure you yourselves create?" "We would be protecting the institution," Thompson said, his eyes like stone. "I trust you'll make the right decision, for Avery's sake, of course." Adriana walked out of his office, her mind reeling. She felt the walls of her carefully constructed world closing in. The choice was impossible. She could sacrifice the man who was saving her daughter, or she could sacrifice her daughter's future. She got into her car and told the driver to take her to her office. When she got there, she sat at her enormous desk and stared at the small, framed crayon drawing of the brave horse and the little mouse. The world Nate and Maya had opened up for her daughter felt a million miles away, and the institution she had always trusted was threatening to burn it to the ground. That night, sleep offered no escape for Adriana. She lay awake in her silent, cavernous bedroom, the city lights painting cold patterns on the ceiling. Her mind, a machine built for strategy and risk mitigation, ran endless simulations. Option A, compliance. She would inform Headmaster Thompson that she agreed to his terms. She would write Nate a generous check, a severance for services rendered, and have him sign a non-disclosure agreement. Avery would be assigned a team of approved, credentialed therapists. Her daughter would hate her for it. The fragile trust they'd built would shatter, but her place at Westbridge would be secure. It was the logical choice, the clean choice. Option B, defiance. She would refuse. The board would convene, and Avery would be expelled. The scandal would be whispered about at galas and charity balls. Adriana Locke, the titan of industry, couldn't even manage her own child. Her carefully curated image would be tarnished. And Avery. What would happen to Avery, cast out of the only school she'd ever known? The source of her anxiety now becoming the reason for her exile. There had to be a third option. There was always a third option. She spent the next day in a fury of quiet, discreet activity, making calls to lawyers, educational consultants, even a crisis PR firm. They all said the same thing in different expensive ways. The school held all the cards. The liability was too great. The janitor was indefensible. Defeated, she knew there was only one person left to talk to. She couldn't make this decision without him. That afternoon, she drove to Westbridge herself, arriving just as the sun began to dip, casting long shadows across the empty quad. She didn't call him to her car. She walked, her heels echoing in the deserted hallways, until she reached the basement. She found him in his small office, carefully packing Maya's backpack for the trip home. He looked up, and his smile faded when he saw the expression on her face. "Adriana," he said, his voice cautious. "Is everything all right?" She didn't waste time with pleasantries. She stood in the doorway of his small, cluttered office, a world away from her own, and laid out the facts with brutal, clinical precision. "I had a meeting with Headmaster Thompson," she began. "He knows about your arrangement with Avery. The board considers you an unqualified liability. They've given me an ultimatum. The arrangement ends, or Avery will be expelled." She watched his face for a reaction. She expected anger, perhaps fear for his job. She saw neither. He just looked tired, a deep, weary sadness settling in his eyes. He slowly sank onto the stool beside his desk. "I see," he said softly. He ran a hand over his face. "I was afraid something like this might happen." He looked up at her, and his expression was one of genuine regret. "I am so sorry, Adriana. The last thing I ever wanted was to cause any trouble for Avery." "It's not your fault," she said, the words surprisingly fierce. He shook his head. "It doesn't matter whose fault it is. This is the way the world works." He stood up, his shoulders slumped with resignation. "You tell Mr. Thompson he doesn't have to worry anymore. I'll stay away from Avery. I won't even look in her direction. It'll be like I don't exist. She'll be upset for a little while, but she's a strong kid. She'll be okay." He was making it easy for her. He was offering her option A on a silver platter, taking the blame, offering to erase himself from the equation to protect his own job and her daughter's future. He was giving her the clean, logical out. And in that moment, hearing him say the words, Adriana felt a white-hot rage build in her chest. Not at him, at the system, at the headmaster, at herself. Erase the problem, make it disappear. It was the philosophy she had lived by her entire life. It's what she had done to her own daughter emotionally for years. Pushed down the messy feelings, ignored the inconvenient pain, tried to make it all disappear. Hearing Nate offer to do the same broke something open inside her. "No," she said, her voice shaking with an intensity that surprised them both. Nate looked at her, confused. "No?" "No," she repeated, stepping fully into his office, into his world. "You are not going to disappear. You are not the problem here, Nate. You're the only thing that's working." She took a breath, the decision crystallizing, solid and real. If they have a problem with you, then they have a problem with me, and they have no idea what a problem I can be. Nate stared at her, speechless. The formidable, untouchable CEO was declaring war on her own institution, for him, for her daughter, for what was right. "Adriana, your daughter's future," he started, but she cut him off. "Her future is a life where she isn't terrified to breathe. It's a life where she knows she has a safe place to land. That's the future I'm fighting for. Westbridge is just a building. You, what you've given her, that's a foundation." The air between them crackled. The power dynamic had vanished. They were no longer the CEO and the janitor. They were two parents, two allies, standing together against a common threat. "So what do we do?" Nate asked, his voice low. Adriana's mind started to click and whir. Not with scenarios of defeat, but with strategies for a fight. "The board meeting is in 3 days. They expect me to fall in line." A slow, dangerous smile touched her lips. "I'm not going to fall in line. I'm going to change the rules of the game." "They won't listen to reason," Nate cautioned. "They're worried about lawyers and insurance policies." "Then we don't give them reason," Adriana said, her eyes landing on the comic book pages spread across Maya's small table. The brave horse and the little mouse. We give them proof. She looked at Nate. A plan beginning to form, a wild, audacious, terrifying plan. You said they need to sit in her world for a while. What if we make them? Nate looked at her, truly seeing the force of nature she was, not as a destroyer, but as a protector. He saw the fire in her eyes, and for the first time since this all began, he felt a flicker of something he hadn't dared to feel. Hope. Okay, he said, a slow smile spreading across his own face. Let's make them. The 3 days leading up to the board meeting were a blur of clandestine activity. Adriana Locke, for the first time in her career, worked against the system she knew so well. Her office became a war room, but the enemy wasn't a corporate rival. It was ignorance. She wasn't preparing for a hostile takeover. She was preparing for a hostile takeover of the heart. Her calls went out not to lawyers, but to AV specialists, ordering a discreet, custom installation in the boardroom, immersive audio and variable lighting, to remain invisible until she gave the signal. Nate's task was more delicate. He found Avery and Maya in their basement nook and sat with them. Some of the grown-ups who run the school, he began gently. They don't understand what helps kids feel safe. We thought, instead of telling them, we could show them. He asked if they would build a model of the school, not how it looks, but how it feels. A spark ignited in Avery's eyes. It was a language she understood, a project, a way to tell her story without saying a word. That evening, Adriana's pristine penthouse was transformed. Rolls of poster board and jars of paint covered the polished floor. When she came home, she found Nate on his knees helping Maya with a paper tree, while Avery meticulously painted a miniature classroom a jarring, chaotic red. Without a word, Adriana took off her blazer, kicked off her heels, and slid onto the floor beside her daughter. "What do you need?" she asked softly. For 2 days they worked, the CEO and the janitor, side by side with their daughters. They built the West Bridge of Avery's mind. The hallways were long and distorted. The gymnasium was a vortex of loud colors. And in the center of it all, in the basement, they built Nate's office. They painted the walls a soft, warm yellow and, using a tiny LED Nate had salvaged, made a single, steady light glow from within. It was an island of calm in a sea of chaos. The night before the meeting, after the diorama sat finished on the dining table like a silent witness, Nate and Adriana stood on her balcony. "Are we insane?" Adriana whispered. Nate smiled. "Probably, but we're in it together." She looked at him, her expression vulnerable. "I'm scared." "Me too," he admitted. The shared fear was a bond stronger than any contract. The next morning, they stood outside the polished oak doors of the Westbridge boardroom. Adriana wore a simple, tailored dress in a soft but strong shade of blue. Nate stood beside her in a clean, pressed-collared shirt, a small remote held discreetly in his hand. Inside that room sat the people who held their children's futures. Behind them, covered by a sheet, sat a messy, beautiful diorama of a little girl's heart. Adriana took a steadying breath, met Nate's gaze, and nodded. She pushed open the doors, and they walked in. The boardroom at Westbridge was a fortress of mahogany and quiet judgment. The 8 members of the board sat like stone figures around the polished table. Headmaster Thompson, at its head, called the meeting to order with grim formality. "Thank you for coming, Adriana," he said, his tone leaving no room for debate. "As you know, the board has reviewed the situation with your daughter and upheld my recommendation. This meeting is simply to confirm that you have terminated the unauthorized arrangement with Mr. Coleman." He nodded curtly toward Nate, who stood near the door, a silent ghost in their world of privilege. All eyes settled on Adriana. They waited for her surrender. She stood, her calm silencing the room. "I cannot confirm that, Robert," she said, her voice clear and steady. "What I can do is show you precisely why." She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod to Nate. He pressed the button on the remote in his hand. Instantly, the room plunged into a disorienting twilight. A distorted school bell shrieked from hidden speakers, making several board members jump. A chaotic swirl of overlapping whispers filled the air. "Did you see her test score? She's so weird. Failure." While the lights flickered with a sick, buzzing rhythm. The fortress had been breached. As the board members exchanged confused, angry glances, Nate stepped forward and unveiled the diorama, placing it in the center of the table. In the dim, unsteady light, its single glowing basement room was a tiny, defiant star. "This is Westbridge Academy." Adriana's voice cut through the noise, powerful and resonant. She gestured to the model, its jarring red classrooms and twisted hallways. "This is what your pursuit of excellence feels like to a child who is terrified of not being perfect." This is the noise inside her head every single day. The board was captivated, trapped within the sensory prison she had created. "We tried your approved methods," she went on, her gaze sweeping across their stunned faces. "We tried specialists and strategies. All they did was add more noise." She pointed to the one spot of light on the table. As she did, the chaotic sounds began to fade, replaced by the soft, clear audio of a child's voice, Maya's, describing the colors of a sunset. "And this," Adriana said, her voice softening, "is where she found silence. Not in a designated wellness center, in a janitor's office, with a man who didn't ask her for anything. He just gave her a safe harbor in the storm." The last of the audio faded into absolute silence. The only light in the room was the steady, warm glow from the tiny office on the table. Adriana looked at each person. "I am not asking you to break your rules for my daughter. I am asking you to be brave enough to admit your rules are not enough." Her voice rose with passion. "I'm asking you to look at the Nates of this world and see not a liability, but your greatest, most untapped asset. I am asking you to build more of these." She tapped the glowing room. More quiet places, more humanity. She took a breath, her gaze unwavering. Avery's future is not what's at stake today. It's the soul of this school. She sat down. The silence that filled the boardroom was total. It was a silence of shock, of revelation, of profound, unexpected truth. The 12 most powerful people at Westbridge stared at the messy, beautiful diorama, their eyes fixed on its single point of light as if it were the only thing left in the world. The profound silence in the boardroom was finally broken by Eleanor Gable, the board's most formidable member. She slowly took off her glasses, her composure shaken. "My grandson was a student here," she said, her voice quiet but carrying the weight of years. "Top of his class. He dropped out of his Ivy League university after one semester. He said he never learned how to handle the silence after the race was over." She looked at Adriana, her eyes glistening. "You didn't just show us your daughter's world. You showed me my grandson's." She put her glasses back on, her old fire rekindled with a new purpose. "I move that we table any discussion of Avery Locke's enrollment indefinitely. I further move that this board fund a new student wellness initiative to be developed and piloted by Mr. Coleman under Mrs. Locke's direct sponsorship." Before a sputtering Headmaster Thompson could object, hands went up around the table. The vote was unanimous. Walking out of the boardroom, the weight of the world seemed to lift from Adriana's shoulders. Nate was beside her, and she reached for his hand, their fingers lacing together naturally. "We did it," she whispered, her voice thick with disbelief and gratitude. He squeezed her hand. "No," he said softly, a proud smile on his face. "You did it." 6 months later, the basement room was no longer a closet, but a sanctuary known as the Quiet Room. The walls were covered in murals of star-filled skies, the floor was covered with soft rugs and beanbag chairs, and the air was filled with a sense of peace. Nate, no longer in a janitor's uniform, was its full-time director. He was sitting on the floor, helping a small boy mend a torn page when the door opened. Avery was there, a confident, smiling version of her former self. She wasn't a patient today. She was a volunteer, and she gently guided a nervous-looking new student toward the art supplies. "It's okay to feel wobbly," Avery told the girl. "This is a good place for wobbly days." Adriana arrived a moment later, not as a CEO on an inspection, but as a mom. She wore jeans and a soft sweater, and she went straight to Maya, who was curled in a reading nook, to ask about Squeaky and Orion's latest adventure. Later, all four of them stood before the last blank wall, paintbrushes in hand, ready to create a new mural of a giant, sprawling sunset. Adriana laughed as her attempt at a cloud came out lumpy and gray. Nate came up behind her, putting his arms around her waist and guiding her hand. "Don't try to control it," he whispered in her ear. "Just let it be what it wants to be." She leaned back against his chest, a feeling of pure, uncomplicated happiness washing over her. She looked at her daughter, laughing with her best friend. She looked at the man she loved. Her world was no longer a vast, empty penthouse, but this small, messy, beautiful room. It was full. It was home. If this story reminded you that the quietest acts of kindness often make the loudest impact, we'd love to know. Where in the world are you watching from? Let us know in the comments below. We read every single one, and it means the world to us to see how far these stories travel. And if you believe that empathy is a superpower, please share this story with someone who might need to hear it. Don't forget to subscribe and click the notification bell, so you never miss a story that proves that the best parts of humanity are not found in boardrooms, but in the heart. Thank you for being here with us. Until next time, stay kind and keep listening.